Hi, I'm Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation. For democracy to work, people need to be well informed. That's why we work with academic experts to share their research and explain issues in the news. Everything we do is free to republish, but we need your support. Please donate to The Conversation by going to donate.theconversation.com or following the link in the show notes.
From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
This week saw the second anniversary of the horrific October 7, 2023 attacks on Israel. The war that followed has had a major impact on social cohesion in Australia. It has fed into a wider debate about immigration, and it has raised questions about Australia's multiculturalism and if it can survive in such a polarised and polarising time. To talk about these issues, we're joined today by Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Technology, Sydney, Andrew Jakubowicz. He's an expert in multiculturalism who's been involved in many documentaries, studies and reports. Andrew Jakubowicz, how do you see the condition of Australia's multiculturalism today?
I'd say it's fragile but under repair. In that sense, I'd say that we've been through an extremely difficult time. We've really had a generation in which the innovations associated with the Australian Multicultural Project have been pulled apart year in, year out, making it a much less supportive structure than it should have been. Like creating a multicultural society is a hard job, right? It just doesn't happen naturally. You're bringing people from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different experiences into an environment where they don't know the others, they don't know people around them. The trust that exists in long-established communities needs to be built, and there are various strategies that need to underpin that building of intergroup trust, right? So I think, in a sense, the condition of Australia's multiculturalism today is affected by the fact that we've not really paid attention over many decades to the problems associated with building intercultural relationships and building stronger communities that work together. We've more or less left that to happen, and we bemoan things when they go wrong, and we slap ourselves on the back when they happen to go right.
Well, it's notable that you take this problem back many years, because I suppose we've been concentrating with the tears in multiculturalism in the last couple of years since the October 7 attacks, but you're saying it's a much deeper, longer problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we need to set up in our heads and remember a bit of our own history. And I'm not trying to turn this into a history lecture, but if you think up to the middle of the 1960s, Australia was proudly a racist society, right? We proudly stood in the world as white Australia, right? We had a huge armory of strategies to keep out people who we didn't think were acceptable, who weren't white. And then in the late 1960s, we made three critical decisions. Some of them because we were changing internally, some of them because the world was changing around us and we were looking increasingly anachronistic. The first of these was we signed on to a United Nations agreement around opposing racism and racial discrimination. That was really important. But along with a small number of other countries, we also said, but we're going not to do stuff about race hate. We're going to let race hate language continue. It was really strange, but that's what we did. Then the Australian government decided we had to do something about the intolerable situation of our Indigenous communities. And in 1967, we passed a referendum which recognised that the Indigenous communities of Australia were part of modern Australian society, which was quite a breakthrough. The third thing we did in about 1968, so all this happened in a very short period, was say, look, we're going to try and reduce and ultimately remove white Australia as part of our migration program. Right? Now, that led to a number of things happening. The first small evidence of multiculturalism was the adoption of integration as a policy in the late 1960s, which basically said it's okay for people to hang on to their culture as long as they become part of the broad society in Australia and they accept our broad cultural values around the rule of law, the equality of people, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a really quite dramatic shift in the Australian consciousness, and most Australians today never experienced that. Right? They didn't know what was left, what we tried to change. But that's very much still been part of the modern story, and it's been a struggle ever since. Like, this has not just been put the car into gear and off we go and everything's perfect. We've always had issues around questions of intergroup relations, and I go back long enough to be able to remember the Indo-Chinese, the first arrival of the Muslims, the struggles which broke out in Australia when the Yugoslav Federation broke up, all sorts of things. We've always had these issues. And the multiculturalism, when it's worked best, recognises those tensions and then tries to resolve them through an equitable incorporation of people into the life of the community. Right? And most of the time that works. We've not really been challenged in quite the way we are being challenged at the moment by what's occurring in the Middle East. And I agree with the point of your question, which is this something special? And I think it really is something special. It's really hard, much harder than anything we've had to deal with before. But I think the other side of it is that the issues in the Middle East, how can I put it? They affect two broad communities very intensely. They affect everyone else not so much. But the effect of that conflict is to generally raise the tideline of hate speech in the society, and that's very, very difficult to manage. Right? And reducing that, letting the water out of the bath and getting the tideline down a bit is really the struggle that we now face. Because you can't order people to behave. You have to work on issues that can help them resolve those things.
So what you're saying is that the conflict in the Middle East over the last couple of years has led to a qualitative change in the problems that our multicultural society faces?
I think I would say a quantitative rather than qualitative, right? I think the level of tension, and particularly between some communities, is very much higher than it's been, right? But we've already seen issues around the sort of levels of multicultural trust during COVID, right? There were many communities who felt very badly done by during the COVID pandemic lockdowns, which already eroded the trust. If I can put it in this way, multicultural societies, in fact, all societies, more or less, or democratic ones, work on the basis of how much trust there is between people, right? Do you trust government? Do you trust this? Do you trust your neighbours, etc.? Right? The higher the level of trust, the more what we call in the sociology world, the more the more social capital that there is that you can build on, right? And that means that there's strength within communities, there's strength between communities, and there's strength between individuals and the wider society as well. All of those three things are challenges to governments all the time. They may not articulate it like that, but that's what they're trying to deal with one way or another. And the clearer they are about what they're trying to do, the more sensible these strategies will be to move forward.
Obviously, multiculturalism, to be successful, involves the right balance between unity, between commitment to the wider society and its values, and on the other hand, diversity, the preservation of diverse cultures. Do you think that that balance is out of whack at the moment?
Well, I think I would say there's another crucial part of this, right? It's not simply about, because you're putting it in terms really of identity questions, right? And it's not actually only about identity, who we think we are, who we identify with and so on. It's also about the reality, what we call in the game, I guess, social justice issues. That is, do people have an equal chance of access to housing? Do they have an equal chance of access to employment, education, and so on? Right? These are really critical. If people start to feel that their opportunities are constrained by the way in which the society views them culturally, then you have the basis of a really difficult schism. And the multicultural story, insofar as it began, let's say 50 years ago, a bit longer than that, was based on the idea that Australia could only flourish for all its citizens if everybody felt they had a fair go in the society. Right? And there were many policy points where people talked about this fair go issue. So I think the current tensions, which are being unfortunately inflamed by people who might have a political interest in that information, really, it's like there's the surface stuff and there's the deeper stuff, right? And often what we see as a social phenomenon is a sort of a reflection of something much deeper that needs to be addressed. And I would say that, if you're thinking about the policy area that we're in, there are really three different policy areas that need to be worked on at the same time. There's a settlement policy, which is about when people come in, enabling them to settle effectively into a society and establish themselves. And in Australia, we sort of do that okay. Then there's what I'd call a multicultural policy, which is really about supporting people within their primary communities to feel safe and maintain their sense of identity and presence. And then the third part, which is absolute, which we do that moderately well. And the third thing, which we don't do very well because we don't really address it properly, is what I'd call a community relations or intercultural policy area. And this is the one that really needs a lot more work than we've done over the last 20 or 30 years. Like when someone like Mr. Hastie says people in Australia think today that, living amongst strangers, that is a reflection at one level. Don't necessarily think it's true, but let's say for the moment it hangs there as a tag in the political debate. Well, that's a reflection of how little we've done to build intercultural interactions. Right? We've tended to be more interested in reinforcing people's sense of self, and there's all sorts of political and bureaucratic and other issues around that I don't want to go into at the moment. But the critical thing is that we need to be addressing these intercultural relations, right? And the central part of the intercultural relations stuff is what academics would call reciprocal recognition. Now, this sounds fairly technical, so I'll try and explain that. What I mean there is that when you enter a diverse society, one of the technical devices you need to get to learn, particularly if you're coming from a monocultural background, is how to interact with and deal with other people who are different from yourself. Right? And that's hard. In the past, we've tended to do it or assume that, for instance, that the public education and Catholic education system would look after a lot of that, right? In the more diverse environment that we have in the bigger cities where people are more clustered together in particular ethnic groups, we need to put a lot more energy into demonstrating why interaction with people who are different from ourselves is a benefit. Like we know from a lot of organisational stuff, for instance, that the more diverse the group of minds are that are addressing a problem, the better the solutions are that you get, right? And I think that works in the wider society. So that's a long answer to your question.
But how do we actually do that? Because on the ground, it's quite difficult, isn't it? It takes resources, it takes a lot of effort by not only governments, local governments and state and federal governments, but also community organisations and the diverse groups in the community.
Yeah, I agree. It is difficult, and that's one of the reasons I think that we often back away from it. Though there have been periods when the tensions external to Australia are less, the opportunities for those collaborative engagements are greater. Right? I mean, if you think about a migrant society as having there are three C's that I play with in this. Right, one is all migrant societies are typified by competition. When people arrive, they try and establish themselves. They go into competition with other groups that are already there. They try and find a niche in their society and so on. So often there can be conflict, and that conflict gets resolved in all sorts of ways. But conflict is also there, which will come from that pleasure. But the most useful part of the whole process, and this is the resolution of it in a sense, is the collaboration and cooperation that emerges out of these dynamics. Right? And I think that collaboration, cooperation is where you'd really want to put the emphasis. I've been talking to a lot of people from Jewish, Muslim, Arab communities over the recent years as all this stuff has blown up. Right? And what I hear from all of them is, and it's really quite extraordinary, what I hear from all of them is, if only they, the other who we're in conflict with, if only they recognized our humanity and our pain, then we would be able to move forward a bit better, right? So my question then to them is to say, okay, do you have to wait for the other to do that for you? Or will you be prepared to initiate something like that? And they tend to say back to me, I would like to be able to initiate it, but I fear from inside my own community the negative background, the negative feedback I would get from the more radical elements in my own community, right? And that could be whether it's Jewish or Muslim or other Arab or whatever. Right? Now, I'm not making this is not a commentary on the rights or wrongs of what's happening in the Middle East. This is a response to a particular set of problems of maintaining Australia as a functioning multicultural society. And I think the multicultural framework review that the government commissioned a year and a half or so ago, which reported about a year ago, had some very interesting ideas as to how you could actually go forward. It recognised, right, that multiculturalism and social cohesion are two sides of the same coin. They're not separate things to be kept in separate areas. You know, one isn't run by police and intelligence and the other run by do-gooder sort of social workers. That's not the way it works. That's when these are integrated into a sense of nation building and the recognition of how people can have a stake in the system and feel that not only do they have a stake in the system, but they have a stake in the system and making sure that other people have a stake in the system is where we need to go. Now, the government set up an independent ministry of multiculturalism under Anne Arley, but for some bizarre reason, it's also created an Office of Social Cohesion under Tony Burke. So the current government, to my mind, has this extraordinarily, what I've described as a structure for dynamic inertia, right? It's got some of the settings right, but it's set up a deeper structure which will make it extremely difficult to advance the sorts of things around interculturalism in particular that I think are absolutely crucial for these sorts of things to move forward.
Why do you think it did this?
I think you'd have to ask them. I think all your questions which relate to what should the government do, what does the government think, it's really their story, not mine. I don't know what they think, but you know Canberra better than I do. There are a lot of interests in which bureaucracies compete with each other, ministers compete with each other. There are spaces which you're allowed into and not allowed into. My view is, I guess, that the Home Affairs structures that were created under the previous Conservative government and embedded under people like Mike Pizzillo and so on, they had a very suspicious surveillance control focus. And the Multicultural Framework Review makes this point very clearly. I don't think that's gone. I think it's been lessened, but I still think it's there. And I think basically governments are totally freaked out by what's been happening over the last couple of years, and they're not sure at all what to do. Right. And I appreciate that. I'm not suggesting I've got an answer that might happen tomorrow. But I think one of the things that's really critical is to go on the front foot around the multicultural story. Paul Kelly's piece in The Australian, where he basically said, time's up, let's get rid of this, which has been the sort of continuing sort of statement from that part of the political environment since at least the beginning of, if not before the beginning of the Howard era. That's not actually particularly helpful because it sort of misreads what's going on. I mean, it's a great feeling if you're a part of a privileged elite in Australia. It's a great feeling to be able to say we don't want our privileges threatened in any way. But it's actually not a good recipe for running a multicultural society.
Now, you spoke about the multiculturalism review that the government set up, but what about the work of the envoys that the government appointed? The envoy to fight anti-Semitism, the envoy to try and combat Islamophobia. What do you think of their recommendations, which the government so far has not formally responded to?
I've read both of their reports in detail. In fact, I'm working on a piece in another life where I'm going to be talking about comparing and contrasting the Islamophobia and anti-Semitism reports. And they're very different documents in the way they're structured and they think about the world and the rest of it. I think what they do extremely well is they capture the sense of pain and astonishment and shock and fear which exists in both the Jewish and Muslim communities at the moment. Right? They do that extremely well. Whether the strategies they suggest are feasible or not, that's not really my story to comment on. Right? I mean, what I find the most interesting is that neither of them really do that particular piece of work which I mentioned before, which is undertake to recognize the pain of others in the society. Right? They look well at the pain of those for whom they're concerned, right? But they don't recognize that we live in a society in which other people feel pain for other reasons, and that developing collaborations between different communities depends initially, at least, on both sides recognizing and respecting the sort of pain that the others have, right? And if you don't do that, you end up with something which I think is far too inward-looking and which fails to adequately recognize that we have to have a society in which people collaborate, not in which they spend their time screaming at each other.
Now, just finally, we're speaking in this second anniversary week after the October 7 attacks, and there's a lot of debate about the demonstrations that we've seen in recent days and demonstrations to come. How do we cope with this intersection between free speech, free protest on the one hand, and preventing hate speech, incitement, disruption on the other?
Well, I think there are a couple of elements in this. One of the things I would say, which I've been saying for far too long in different contexts, is Australia should go back and revisit its relationship to the international agreement on opposing racial discrimination. And I think it should remove the reservation it has on hate speech. Right? I mean, it's really stupid in this day and age to have something to in fact, say on the basis of principle that people should have the right to, it's part of an international agreement that this country would say that hate speech is fine, right? I think that's got to be reversed. No sign of it from government, no sign of it from the opposition, but I think that's a really critical thing. So that's the bigger story and fairly easy to do. The more direct questions about how do we manage these relationships, I think there are a couple of things we need to recognise. First is that within any community, there is a broad range of values and attitudes about issues. And in most communities, you're going to find that at one end, there are people who are very rigid in their views, very, how can I put it, very authoritarian about the way they see the world, right? And that they will be doing a lot of work to try and convince other people in their community to follow their lead. Right? I think that they need to be called out wherever that occurs, and that the emphasis should be placed, particularly by leaders within communities, right? So whatever they may be, that the aim of if you're living in Australia, there are great benefits you gain from having a society which has free speech and freedom to protest and so on, and that everyone has that right. And if you don't want to be on the receiving end of a lot of crap, put it mildly, then you should be careful about what you say about other people, right? And my own view is that it's in part up to the communities and probably the media broadly to isolate groups that have as their goal the fragmentation of the Australian social fabric, right? Wherever that may be. And I think that that's a very, very important role for government spokespeople, but I also think it's important for community groups, whatever they are, right? That they should not be licensing or legitimising or accepting representational statements from people from within communities, which have as their goal the sort of hate directed at people with whom they disagree. Right? That's really hard. I'm not saying it's easy. I mean, when I was talking to the leaders of the Jewish and Muslim communities, Arab communities, they all expressed a great desire to reach out and a great fear of doing so, but not fear from the other side, fear from their own side. And I think that's something that we need to recognise that exists as part of the story of this great multicultural society we're trying to form.
Andrew Jakubowicz, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today about these difficult issues. That's all for today's Politics podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.